Well, hello everyone and welcome. I'm Jerry Rice of the Communication Department here at the IMF. Delighted to introduce this event, which I will do very briefly. Wasn't that an inspirational video? And that's good because I think we call this in our department the inspirational event. So we have an inspirational video to begin for this inspirational event and two inspirational women who are going to lead us tonight. Of course, our special guest is Saadia Zahidi, as was just mentioned in the video. And her resume, although she is still incredibly young, her resume reads like she's been around forever. Saadia works at the World Economic Forum, where she's a member of the executive committee there and head of education, gender, and work. She is also the founder and co-author of the WEF's Global Gender Gap, Human Capital and Future of Jobs reports. There's more. She was selected as one of the BBC's 100 Women Driving Change in Economics, Politics and Society. And her book, and everyone gets a copy of the book tonight, 50 Million Rising, The New Generation of Working Women Transforming the Muslim World. That book has already won the inaugural FT McKinsey Brackenbauer Prize for Prospective Authors under the age of 35. So we're delighted to have Saadia with us tonight as one of our inspirational women. The other inspirational woman is, of course, Sabina Bhatia. And Sabina, I'm proud to say, works with me and my team in the communication department. Sabina is the assistant to the director there. She's also the division chief in the public affairs division, which amongst other things helps us to work with and listen to parliamentarians, civil society, labor unions and other external stakeholders. And, you know, Sabina deserves credit for inspiring this event in the first place. This is actually the third time around at our spring and annual meetings. And I think we can say it's now become a feature of our meetings. So thanks to Sabina for that. There's just one other inspirational young lady that I just want to mention who's in the audience tonight. And that is Priyanka Bhatia. And I won't embarrass her too much, but Priyanka is, of course, Sabina's daughter and Matthew's daughter. And I think she's here tonight serving as an inspiration to us all of the younger generation who's coming forward and is going to lead us into the future. With that, please give our two inspirational women a very warm welcome.
Thank you, Jerry. Well, hello, everybody. We have a great event for you this evening. Over the next hour or so, we're going to explore the stories of some of these amazing 50 million women in the Muslim world. Who are these women leading the silent revolution, upending cultural norms, carving out spaces for themselves, and shaping their own destinies? And how is this empowerment transforming their societies, economies, and even the mindset of the next generation? So to discuss this with us, we have Saadia. And a warm welcome, Saadia.
Thank you.
And you all have a copy of this book, as Jerry mentioned, and Saadia has kindly agreed to sign copies after this conversation. And I hope after listening to Saadia, you will be inspired to read the book. So let's get started. So Saadia, let me say that this is a fascinating book, rich in data and inspiring stories. So what inspired you to write this book?
First of all, let me just thank Jerry and my ex-colleague Dije. We used to work together at the World Economic Forum for having me here. It's great to be here, as a as a student a very long time ago, it was a dream to make it to the IMF. So I'm glad that I'm here today. What inspired me to write the book? I work with at the Forum on Education, Gender and Employment. And for the last 12 years, we've been publishing the Global Gender Gap Report, along with my co-author, Laura Tyson, who's also here, and co-author colleagues back at the World Economic Forum. And that data, you know, a lot of countries from the Muslim world tend to rank quite low in those rankings. But they've also been amongst the countries that have been making the fastest progress. So the country in the last 10 years that has moved forward the fastest on the economic gender gap is Saudi Arabia. So starting to see trends like that, I wanted to look more broadly at what that data is saying. And once I spotted the trend, you know, I was just simply curious about what does that mean for those societies? What does that mean for those economies? What does that mean for those businesses? And then, of course, last but not least, where I come from, that has been a big part of the curiosity.
So tell us about that. Tell us about growing up in Pakistan, and your grandparents moved from India to Pakistan. Is that right?
Yeah, so 3 of my grandparents moved from Kashmir. 1 moved from India, from Delhi, and that generation was, you know, very much about movement and migration. And then my parents built a very sort of stable life, and then my sister and I have done the opposite: move away from the country and move again, similar to my grandparents' generation. But growing up in Pakistan, I mean, I think I was incredibly lucky compared to a lot of other people, because my parents fundamentally believed in education and investing in that education for any of their children. But they happened to have 2 girls. And one of the things that I've said publicly, to the annoyance of my parents, is that my greatest fear growing up was that I would end up having a brother at some point. Because even as a child, I knew that this investment is happening because we happen to be 2 girls. But if my parents did have a boy, it would actually be a perfectly rational calculation on their part to think about investing more in that boy. And I think that's probably something that a lot of Pakistani girls grow up with in one way or the other.
But, you know, that's a phenomena that you see not just in Pakistan. It's not unique. You see it in the rest of South Asia, and in fact in other countries as well. This bias towards boys, which is slowly changing, right, as more people are getting educated. It's interesting that you talk about your grandparents moving, because my own grandparents made the same journey, but in the opposite direction.
Right. Yeah.
And so here we are, 70 years later, sitting at the IMF. So who would have thought that in 1947? So it gives you a pause, right? So you talked about your grandparents. In your book, you talk about your mother and your grandmother as inspirational figures. So tell us a little about them, and did you have other role models growing up in Pakistan?
Yeah. You know, I talk a little bit about both my grandmothers, and one of them was highly educated for that time, one of the few women to have a higher education degree very soon after the country was formed, which was incredibly rare for somebody in her generation. And the other was not. And of course, you know, both, it's family and it means so much. But over time, as you start getting older, I think you start noticing that one person has more agency, has more independence, has more opinions, and the other person does not. And so that difference became quite clear. And my grandmother, who was more educated, was also a teacher for a very long time. And my own mother went into the same profession, becoming a professor had a 30-year career as a professor in a women's college. But at the same time, for me, that always felt, well, that's a kosher profession for women, teaching. The other one that was also somewhat accepted was becoming a doctor. I'd say that probably the moment that was a big game changer for me was my father's a geophysicist, and going with him to a gas field when I was about 10 years old. And I had been before, and I had, you know, seen some of I was very curious about the science of it, and I was looking at the machinery and the equipment they were using. But what my dad and his colleagues were much more excited to tell me about was the fact that for the first time ever in this gas field, they had a women's bathroom. And I was wondering why that would be, because clearly there were no women in this place. And so they took me to this trailer and said, we want to introduce you to someone. And it was the first woman engineer that that company had hired, and who was actually working on that gas field. And this moment where there's this lady in her shalwar kameez and wearing her, big boots and her hard hat on this gas field, that was for me a transformational moment, because I hadn't seen a woman take on that kind of a role, and in particular in the midst of all of these men who were my father's colleagues and who all had this one way of working in this very scientific field, and suddenly there was this woman amongst them. So that was for me a big game changer.
Right. That was a fascinating story. So turning to the book, can you tell us a little more? Who are these 50 million women, and why now? Why is this a unique moment in the Muslim world?
So up until, you had this in the intro video, but up until the turn of the millennium, there were approximately 100 million women working across the entire Muslim world. And I should probably qualify what I mean by the Muslim world. The way I'm looking at this in this book, obviously we're talking about an extremely culturally diverse set of countries. We're talking about a geographically diverse set of countries, economically diverse set of countries. I look at 30 Muslim majority countries. I define Muslim majority as having a population of more than 60% that identifies as Muslim, and only at those countries that are either lower middle income, upper middle income, or higher income countries. So I'm not looking at the lowest income countries, and I'm not looking at the countries that are in an active conflict or have been in the last decade or so. So it's a very specific set of 30 countries, which make up a population of about 1.2 billion. So it's a large part of the Muslim majority world. Now, within this group, only 100 million women working at the turn of the millennium is an extremely small percentage of what could be the adult workforce. What has changed is we've reached about 155 million. And that is a tipping point because it hits that 30% critical mass across the entire adult female potential workforce in those countries. 30% tends to be this number after which, in a lot of the diversity literature, the minority is not such a minority anymore. And I think that's what makes this a critical moment of change. And this has happened very rapidly. So this is essentially a 50% increase in the last 15 years alone. And we're talking about incredibly small numbers in the decade before that, from 1990 to the year 2000. So a lot of rapid change in a relatively small period of time, and much of the base of it is because of the educational investments that were already made in previous decades. And I can talk a bit more about that.
But a lot of that has to do with the demographics, is that right? Because you talk in your book, you have some really interesting statistics that about the youth, and you say that the median age in the Muslim world is 23 compared to the global median of 28, so much younger population. And within that, you say that the 15 to 29-year-old cohort is the most educated generation in these countries. And moreover, girls are getting educated at a faster pace than boys. So given all that's happening, this educational revolution, what are the implications of this for women, their aspirations, and where do they go with this education?
So some of this investment has been happening for certainly more decades than this workforce transformation. So to give an example, you saw the 10% of Pakistani women are now going to university. To put that in context, 10 years ago, only 2% of Pakistani women were going to university. And that, in a period of about 10 to 12 years, is a very rapid change. During that same time period, men were going to university at a rate of 3%, and today that's at 9%. So it's just, women are starting to move forward faster, even when it comes to university education. When it comes to primary and secondary education, there are definitely still gender gaps. There are definitely still parts of the Muslim world in which there are those gaps, but many places where that has been completely reversed. So for example, again, in universities in Saudi Arabia, there are more women relative to the cohort enrolled in university than there are in Brazil, than there are in China, than there are in India, than there are in Mexico. So we're talking about a very, very big shift, and I think one where we tend not to look at those particular emerging markets as ones that have a very large pipeline of women coming out of university. But your question was, where did they go from here? And that's been the shift in the last 10 years in particular. Those women are starting to now venture into the workforce. They're starting to use their talent for various forms of economic opportunity. One piece of this is companies are starting to realize that the base of their future white-collar workforce is going to be more female than it is male, because women are coming out of universities in much higher numbers than men. So companies are starting to recognize that they're going to have to change their recruitment practices if they want talent in the future. The other end of this is economic necessity. So for most middle-class families that have aspirations for social mobility, that want more for their children in the future, it is simply no longer possible to have the traditional breadwinner and traditional caregiver model. So that economic necessity is the second reason that's driving this change. And then the third aspect is access to technology. It's actually not really necessary in a lot of these places for women to be accessing the traditional workforce outside the home. They can actually be doing a lot more inside the home, and we'll talk about that as well. And then a fourth aspect is, of course, the fact that this is not just the most educated generation in these countries, but it's also the most technologically savvy generation in any of these countries. And this youth bulge, this baby boom inside the Muslim world is coinciding with this wave of globalization and technology. And they now have access to role models around the world. A lot of women that I spoke to as part of the interviews for this book, they said, well, my mother only ever looked at what her sisters were doing, what her mother was doing, and maybe at best what was happening in her neighborhood. I am looking at what Sheryl Sandberg is saying around, halfway around the world. I'm looking at what women in China are doing. I'm looking at what women in Africa are doing, and then I'm making my own choices. It doesn't mean that I'm imitating the same model, but I now have a much wider range of choices and role models available to me. And that aspect, I think the psychological component of this is also huge.
That's really interesting. So you talked about technology. One of the things I was struck by in the video talked about that was the number of girls in STEM, science, technology, engineering, math. And in many countries in the world, of course, there are far fewer women and girls going into the STEM fields than boys. But the picture is quite different in the Muslim majority countries. In Iran, for example, 70% of the science and engineering students are women. And then in several countries, more than 40% of STEM students are women. So what's going on here? Why is it that you have such a different picture compared to, let's say, even the Nordic countries where women are, it's much more egalitarian?
Yeah. Can I layer on even more to that data
Please
for a
do.
second? If you look at all of the STEM-related degrees that recent graduates are coming out with, and you look at current enrollment, there are only 5 countries in the entire world where more than 50% of those that are graduating with STEM degrees are women. And 2 of those 5 countries happen to be Muslim-majority countries. So that's Kuwait and Brunei. And then if you look at the 18 countries in the world in which at least 40% of those graduates happen to be women, more than half of them, so 10 out of the 18 are Muslim majority countries. So there is something happening here. And we were talking a little bit before about what the reasons behind that might be. Now, this is not, there's no data for this, there's no evidence for this, but speaking to some of these women and some of the graduates from these degrees, there are probably a couple of reasons. One is much more about what society values in the labor market. And so a number of them said, well, my parents said, okay, if you are going to be the first to go to university, you should at least do something useful. And even if you're not expected to be using that degree afterwards in the labor market, because that's not necessarily the aspiration for a lot of their daughters, well, at least you should study something that's a hard science. You should study something that is useful. The second reason, I think, is it's almost as if the lack of role models has been a blessing in disguise. The lack of role models also means a lack of stereotypes. If you don't have an older generation that's been working at all, then actually you don't have the bias that, well, I can't go into computer science because that's a very male-dominated field, or I can't go into engineering because that's very male-dominated. Because by and large, you don't really have an older generation that's been working in very large numbers. And so in some ways, if everything was off limits for their mothers and their grandmothers' generation, in some ways nothing is off limits for theirs, because they're trying all of this for the first time. And so they're going into subjects that they enjoy. I had a lot of young women who were in STEM degrees tell me, I simply went into what I liked. I liked math. I would have, one of these women, Samira Najam, who we'll talk about in a bit, she said, if there was a mathematics Olympics, I would have won gold. I'm that passionate about math, and that's what I wanted to go into. So for a lot of them, it's simply about what am I passionate about, and not so much about how that might be used afterwards and what the stereotypes around that subject might be.
But how much is it the social pressure? You talked a little bit about it, but isn't it also the case that in many countries, somehow doing a useful degree like, engineering or being a doctor is something useful, whereas why would you do the humanities and the arts?
Yeah. There is definitely, I can certainly tell you from a Pakistani perspective, I don't know if this applies broadly across these countries because I didn't do enough of that question, but certainly there is a bit of a hierarchy when it comes to a number of these degrees. So, computer science and engineering might be near the top. A few of the other natural sciences might come afterwards. And then social sciences, well, barely passable, especially economics, but they're somewhat acceptable, and then maybe the humanities, and then maybe the arts. And so there is a little bit of this hierarchy, and I think that pressure does go into it. But what you're pointing to, I think, is the flip side of this. There's also, to some extent, a social premium when it comes to a certain type of degrees. So again, in a place like Pakistan, there is a premium in the marriage market when it comes to women with medical degrees. Families are looking for daughter-in-laws who have medical degrees, even though they are not expecting them to be working afterwards. And this is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, this is a validation of the fact that now women with higher education, this is seen as a good thing, even when it comes to the marriage market in fairly traditional families. On the other hand, the other side of it is that those women are then often discouraged from using those degrees in the labor market, and places like Pakistan end up with a severe lack of doctors because the majority of those coming out of medical school are women, but a very small minority of them are actually practicing.
Yeah, that's a shame. As you know, the IMF's done a lot of research on looking at women's labor force participation and how more women actually has an impact on growth of the economy. And did you find that in the Muslim world as well?
Yeah, absolutely. That correlation applies here as well. And I think in a number of these countries that correlation is evident. Now, of course, the causation is something else, but I think the very same logic applies to anywhere else in the world. I think this institution and many other institutions have shown how if half of your human potential is composed of women, particularly those that are coming out with some of the most important skills in that economy, then of course, by necessity, if they're not being then deployed in the economy, if they're not then able to fulfill their full potential through economic opportunity, that is going to be a waste for that country's growth and competitiveness in the future. And I think the very same argument applies here as well.
So you talk a lot about the gig economy and the transformational impact that has had in bringing more women into the labor force, precisely to unleash their potential. So you describe these millennial Muslim women, and these are your words, worldly, digitally connected, and determined. So talk to us a little bit about the opportunities the digital revolution has unleashed for these women.
There are a number of aspects to this. One piece is that because a lot of women are actually coming out with STEM degrees, they are very proactively creating some of these gig economy platforms. They are the owners of these platforms. The second aspect is the gig economy allows for being able to work or at least to earn a living in a way that doesn't necessarily require leaving the home for a traditional office. So these two dynamics play into this. On the first one, you know, I walked away extremely excited about what it means to have women being the leading tech entrepreneurs in some of these economies. Not in all fields and not necessarily always the majority, but the fact that they are extremely visible leaders of trying to find solutions to specific problems by using new technologies. So I mentioned Samira Najam before. She was this young woman in Cairo with a computer science degree, passion for math and coding, and who had been working for a multinational company in Cairo designing or coding for auto parking features. Now, for those of you who've been to Cairo or are from Cairo, the auto parking feature is not one that you're necessarily going to be using a lot of. And she said that, you know, I felt I was spending a lot of time designing something that a lot of folks are not using. And her daily commute was somewhere upward of 3 hours because of the amount of traffic congestion in the city. She happened to go to her first trip abroad in Germany, and a colleague of hers showed her a ride-sharing app, and she used it to go between Stuttgart and Cologne. And she came back to Cairo and back to the daily grind of her commute and found herself thinking, well, what if I brought a similar solution here? But I also tried to address the problem that, in particular, women face in public transport, which is sexual harassment, and try to inbuild the safety into this particular app by having coworkers who live in similar neighborhoods ride together to their workplaces. And so she left her job. She developed this app. It's now working very well. It's been given prizes by, you know, the ministry. It's been given a number of exciting new opportunities. A lot of companies are now starting to use it. And her passion was simply solve this problem, solve the traffic congestion problem, solve the problem of safe ways of working, solve the particular problem of people wanting to be, pay each other in a way that was culturally acceptable. And so she just went about trying to solve all of these problems using her technical skills and using her local knowledge. And that's what I found most exciting about a lot of the gig platforms that women are creating. They're trying to solve incredibly local problems and using some of these technologies. So, you know, we talked about the doctor's example. A young woman called Sarah Khurram was herself one of these women who had a medical degree. And after she got married and got pregnant with her first child, actually stopped working as well. And she's gone back and thought, well, how can I actually help solve this problem, and has helped create a new platform called Doctors. It's a video platform essentially connecting women who have medical degrees, who happen to now be housewives. They get a little bit of initial retraining and upskilling, brought up back to the standards that would be required for them to be able to provide medical services online, and connecting them with extremely remote parts of the country, in particular with other women who otherwise may never receive any medical services at all. And so it's, again, solving this very local problem using some of these new technologies. And then there are others, and they're not necessarily platforms who run by women. So there's a man called Walid Abdul Rahman who's created Mum Foods. Again, it started out in Cairo. And what he's trying to do is connect a lot of women who are at home and whose greatest skill set is being able to cook very well, because that's what they've been doing in their families for a very long time. They're not necessarily women with a lot of higher education. Some of them are, some are not. But that's what they've mainly been doing, and that's their skill set. So he's connecting them with all of these urban professionals that are looking for healthier food options to be delivered to their offices. Again, because of the traffic congestion problem, it would be very difficult to be going out to restaurants, etc. And so the food gets delivered to them. So he's created this platform. And there are many other examples that are basically tapping into this underutilized resource of women who are able to now provide their services through these platforms.
Interesting. Talk to us a little bit about the social barriers that women face as they enter the workforce, and how are Muslim women, this young millennial women who are joining the workforce, how are they navigating through these complex societal expectations of their roles, you know, the old expectations, the new world that's awaiting them, and how do they manage them?
I think probably the best description that I heard was from one woman in her mid-30s or so, who basically said, I know that I am the transition generation. And I think that is a very apt way of describing what is happening here. Her point was, I'm the first generation in my family to have a university degree, and I'm the first who has kept working after getting married. Her mother did work in her early days right out of university, but then very quickly, as soon as she got married, she stopped working. And she said, I'm the first one who's kept working. I have children, and I've kept working even after having children. But my aspirations for my son and for my daughter are completely different from anything that my parents ever had for me. And so I'm going to do this shift. I'm going to find this third way, which allows me to have these economic aspirations, use economic opportunity, and at the same time fulfill my social obligations. But I'm expecting my daughter to be doing something completely different. And that social obligation essentially means still being completely responsible for all caregiving responsibilities in the home. Now, in most parts of the world, women spend a whole lot more time on unpaid work and on care work than men do. In India, it's something like 5 times as much as what men do, and in Scandinavia, roughly speaking, it's about 1.5 times as much time as men spend on unpaid work. In a lot of these, the countries that I'm covering, the numbers look different in different countries, but that discrepancy is still very much there. And a number of the women that are going into the workforce that are part of this transition generation have assumed that responsibility. This is not something that they're necessarily trying to proactively change. They're instead using some of the resources at their disposal. In a lot of these emerging markets, low-skilled workers are easy to hire, are generally paid quite little. And this, again, is a double-edged sword. They're tending to create a lot of new opportunities for lower-skilled women in particular, hiring them as household help. On the other hand, that is then keeping those women often stuck at that level. And so, there's this one example of a journalist in Jakarta, and I went to her home to visit her, to interview her, and it was really meant to be about her. And then we started talking to the woman who was supporting her with the childcare in her home, and she has a 2-year-old daughter. And it turns out that the woman who was providing that support also has a 2-year-old daughter, but in her case, she can't afford to have any real childcare, and so she basically leaves her daughter with her neighbor while she's taking care of the journalist's daughter. So there is this new cycle that has been created where middle-income and higher-income women are essentially hiring lower-income women to provide some of the support for the care-related work and turning some of that unpaid work into paid work. It is creating a new range of opportunities, particularly for rural women that are migrating into urban areas. And at the same time, it is then not really allowing a lot of those women to move away from some of that lower skilled work and to find new opportunity after they've arrived in these urban areas. So it is this double-edged sword. The other aspect, the other way in which a number of these women are essentially subsidizing their dual role, the double job that they've taken on both in the workforce and in the home, is family networks. In a lot of these societies, there are still extremely close family networks. There are parents that are living with the younger generation, and it's a lot of grandmothers that are providing some of that childcare and some of that support inside the home. Now, whether this lasts into the future, I think remains to be seen, but that's how a lot of the women in this transition generation are finding the solution. Now, at the same time, I do think there are some exceptions to this. I was at a dinner with a number of young millennial couples in Saudi Arabia, and hearing about how they manage their work-life balance in the home, how much the men help out, how much the women help out, it often felt like these were probably couples that had a lot more in common with other young couples in Shanghai or in Brooklyn or in London than they did with their own parents' generation. And they said as much. So there is also a shift happening in the attitudes of men, but it tends to be limited to the very highest income brackets.
Interesting. But of course, the phenomena of the transition generation you're talking about, relying on low-income women to help out with childcare, something you see here as well. You know, a lot of women, a lot of us are able to work because we have nannies, and very often they in fact come from low-income countries, from the Philippines, etc. So it's a phenomena that continues to play out. But I'm going to ask you something that is somewhat controversial, and you and I discussed this before. So you talk a lot in your book about the hijab, the headscarf. You yourself don't wear one. So can you share with us what you learned? You interviewed hundreds of women as you wrote this book. Share with us some of their perspectives and your own perspectives.
Sure. I think there are probably a lot of biases about the hijab. I know that I certainly went in with some bias, and this is a bias that tends to exist between women that cover and don't cover in a lot of these countries. That's probably where my bias came from. And that bias also exists when we apply a sort of a Western lens onto Muslim women who choose to cover. And I did ask the question head on to a number of the women that I was speaking to, and a lot of them just said it's a non-issue. This is not what I'm interested in talking about. I'm interested in talking about how I'm going to have safer transport to get to work. I'm interested in talking about how I'm going to get childcare. I'm interested in talking about what kind of job opportunities I have. I'm interested in talking about how I'm going to get my next promotion. But I'm not really interested in talking about why I choose to cover. It's something that I happen to do, and it has zero impact in the economic opportunity that I'm carving out for myself. And a number of them actually didn't really want to be having the interview if this was a question that we were going to focus on some more. And I think that is very telling about where this has ended up. The other reason I talk about the headscarf is or rather modest clothing as a whole is it is a massive industry. So it's an industry that is currently valued at about $96 billion around the world, the modest fashion industry. And it's likely to grow a lot more. And a number of the women, so we talked about the gig economy platforms and also the e-commerce platforms, a lot of women are realizing that this is a huge opportunity for their generation that wants a fresher take on what modest fashion means. They want something that is different from what their mother's generation or their grandmother's generation had, and they're essentially creating new businesses that are based around modest fashion. A lot of Western brands are now starting to catch up and actually go into the territory that these women have already pioneered.
So, Saadia, your book is refreshing in that it defies cultural stereotypes, especially some of the narratives that are portrayed in the Western media. But some would say that you're too optimistic. So what would you say to that?
No, I'm looking at the trends that have happened so far. There's no reason to imagine that those trends will absolutely continue into the future, but I would say that the signs are very, very hopeful. So if we did project these trends out into the future, the 50 million additional women that joined the workforce in the last years, that took 15 years. It will take just another 7 years for that additional number to double. So by 2025, yet another additional 50 million women will have joined the workforce. But if I go by a lot of the conversations with the local analysts, with a lot of the local women, with a local number of local professors, again, in granted very different parts of the world. It looks very different in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Kazakhstan than it does in Tunisia or Saudi Arabia or Pakistan. So these are very, very different environments. But on the whole, the larger trend that 210 million total by 2025 is likely to be an underestimate because of the pace of this change, because of the fact that companies realize that they need this talent, because of the fact that globalization and technology are bringing a lot of new opportunities, and because of the fact that the education investment has not just already been made, but it is continuing. This trend of more women going into university than before, or than men, is not a trend that's dying out. If anything, that's probably a trend that is picking up. So I certainly remain optimistic, having heard all of that. The one caveat is the role of men and their reaction to the change that is taking place. So I spoke to a lot of very proud fathers who are very excited about this new opportunity for their daughters, who have been grudging in this change and yet have realized that this is something that is not just bringing in more economic opportunity to their household, more funds, more finances to their household, but is also actually something that is empowering their daughters. So there is that. At the same time, in particular in a lot of the countries which have very high youth unemployment, there are a number of young men who were told their entire lives when they were growing up that they are expected to be the primary breadwinner, and that they will be the ones who goes out into the world and provides for their family. Now they turn around and their sister, who's got a better education, better grades, has got a better job. And so there is, to some extent, this possibility of a sort of backlash from some of the young men that are not also finding equal opportunity. And a lot of the women that I spoke to said that this is the one thing, the one trend that worries them, and nobody is helping pull along some of the young men that might be disillusioned by the new role that they have in society, the new shared role they have in society.
Yeah, I mean, I think you find that here as well, that, you know, for women and for girls to grow and be empowered, you need the support of your fathers, your brothers, your significant others. Anyway, so I'm going to open it up, the floor up to questions. There's a microphone, so if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll call on you. I think there's a question there.
Hi, my name is Mariam. I'm from Pakistan. And it is really inspiring to see somebody from Pakistan sitting there, and I'm really inspired. And I have a question regarding the whole perspective of women workforce, especially in Pakistan. Considering a large market in Pakistan is like an informal sector, and women working in that sector are being exploited in terms of like, because I've been working in skill development for a while, and I've seen that there's no policy for home-based workers and women working in informal sector. So what do you have to say about that, if you can shed some light on that?
Sure. I think that's a question that across a lot of emerging and developed markets, that's something that we have to grapple with and figure out better policies for, because in general, in a lot of advanced countries as well, you don't really have a clear status for workers that are using some of these gig platforms or that are working from home. I don't know if you were referring specifically to those that are working from home using gig platforms, but there are a lot of laws and policies that need to change. At the same time, I would say, I mean, we tend to think of that kind of work as precarious work in a lot of advanced economies, but it depends on what the work is. But what I heard from a lot of these women was it's the first time that they have any form of guarantee that they will actually get paid because they're using a mobile phone to deliver some of these services. It's the first time that they know that their particular work will be registered. And a couple of policymakers that I spoke to said, it's the first time we might actually be able to tap into the power of that informal workforce, because for the first time we can see at least a part of it. Not all of it, because a lot of it is not digitally connected work from the home, but where we can see it, it gives us a first-time opportunity to start registering some of it. and then designing some policies around it. So I would say it depends on what the work is. That's not to say that there aren't situations where essentially you're starting to have the rise of a new kind of digital sweatshop. And I think that is definitely something to be watching for too. So it's not by no means meant to be work that doesn't come with some level of precarious nature or some lack of safety being involved in it. It is definitely something that also has to be looked at.
There's a question there.
Hi, I'm Minu Matthews. Thank you so much for such an insightful discussion. I was just wondering, so 50 Million Rising discusses economic freedom and opportunity among the Muslim world for women. Of course, in politics, women are still lagging behind in those countries, and I'm just wondering how you think that economic freedom will carry over into the political sphere.
Sure. You know, in a lot of this book, the one running kind of theme is economics might end up trumping culture, because a lot of these women will gain the economic freedoms or the economic agency first, and then that has all kinds of cultural changes and political changes associated with it. There are probably a couple of things going on that I think can be hopeful. One, because these women are future taxpayers, future voters in some cases, not all of these countries are democracies, there is starting to be a higher level of scrutiny being paid by existing policymakers, whether men or women, to what these women are asking for. You can see that in changes such as in Saudi Arabia. There's a new law recently, a couple of months ago, which is essentially making it easier for women to be able to register their businesses without having a male guardian involved. And there are other parts of the Muslim world in which there are much more advanced laws that are taking place now. So there's some of that shift, which I think, whether those are male policymakers or female policymakers, will lead to a difference. But the pipeline of women that need to be going into politics, that's an area where I'm less hopeful, because I don't see a major trend that is changing. Sure, some of these countries, including my own, have had female prime ministers, and that has tended to be a very positive sign. I mean, I certainly remember seeing Benazir Bhutto as a role model and thinking, wow, women can actually run the country. So the mindset shift that leads to, for both women and men, for boys and for girls, that is very important, but that's just a few limited positions. There isn't necessarily the pipeline that is going into ministerial roles, into parliamentary positions, and into local politics. That's where I'm a little bit less hopeful, but I would imagine that the policymakers that will have to make some of these changes for these economically empowered women will then lead to other shifts as well.
Other questions? Oh, there's one more there.
Hi. So I was a little apprehensive walking in here, but I would like to thank you. Your honesty is refreshing. So my question is that you mentioned that a lot of young women feel worried and that about a possible resentment among young men about this new trend. So how would you recommend that those young men can, as you said, pulled along?
You know, there's Lubna Olayan is one of the highest ranking businesswomen in anywhere in the world, but also in Saudi Arabia in particular. And she had some really interesting thoughts on this in this area. Her view was, you want to make some of these changes, but you don't want to break society while doing it. And there's such a rapid change happening already in the economic sphere that let's make that change, but let's do it in a way that helps pull others along. And that means ensuring that men become more aware of what the gains are for everybody, and not just thinking of this as a zero-sum game in which they now have to compete for a very limited number of jobs against a larger pool of people that are looking for them. And so her view was, let's make the gains a lot clearer, in the common gains a lot clearer, whether it is inside families, and that will require a lot more of sort of governments, advertising agencies, and others to get involved in that kind of change. Let's make the gains clearer in schools and in universities. And in her particular case, let's make the gains clearer inside corporations, inside companies. And I heard this from a number of the different CEOs. This has been very focused on the sort of the economic aspects of this. So I spoke to a lot of male and female CEOs, and their view was women tend to be more, our female staff members tend to be more hungry for opportunity because they're getting it for the first time. And so they are charging ahead in terms of their performance, they're charging ahead in terms of promotions, they're bold about what they want to try to achieve. And that has led to some extent to a lot of sort of some level of anxiety on the part of some of the men that have traditionally thought this is a realm that is open only to them. And so they've had to very proactively educate and re-educate and retrain some of the men about how to behave in this mixed work environment, how to see this as a positive, why this is a positive, what that diversity leads to. And so I think just essentially communicating the gains much better is one way to go.
Yeah, I think there's a question there and one there.
Hi. So you spoke a lot about, you shared a lot of stories about women entrepreneurs who came up with these impactful ventures. And I guess through your research, my question would be, can you share some advice to young millennials who want to start their own ventures? What, did you see any underlying factors that all these women maybe took this path that led them to create their ventures? That makes sense.
I'd say probably the one factor that I saw that seems to have been the main one that led to their success, they were trying to solve a problem. They did not set out trying to create a unicorn. They set out trying to solve one particular problem. They knew exactly the gap they were trying to fill, and that's what they went after. And I think it's, you know, one of the things that I find fascinating that I want to look into a little bit more is some of these gig platforms are probably not, remains to be seen, but they're not necessarily going to grow to monopoly size because they're trying to solve a very niche, very particular problem. And so the gig economy itself just seems to have more competition, more diversity in some of these countries. And I think just using that combined power of technology and trying to solve a local problem with your local knowledge is probably one way to go.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. So,
Okay. Thank you. My name is Lida, and I am a women's rights defender coming from Armenia. And basically, well, the whole presentation was really nice, and what I found was very optimistic. But I really want to speak about not so cool parts, like, for example, what were the challenges for a lot of women who were not so lucky or privileged to have the chance to be in the market economy. I would like to talk about the discrimination in the workplaces, whether you have observed this kind of information. What is the situation in, for example, abusive relationship or not letting women work by their husbands or by other male family member? So what is the situation and your observations in this regard? Thank you.
You know, none of this research is to say that there aren't problems. None of this research is to say that even for these women, these have not been incredibly hard-won gains. These are not necessarily elite women. These are not necessarily women that are in the highest income brackets. These are women that are lower middle class in many cases. Many of them are unskilled women that are for the first time trying to venture into the labor market. So this is not by any means for one particular privileged class. There's been a lot of hard-won gains for these set of women. But the reason I wanted to focus on this is because this is the undocumented part. I think we hear a lot more about where things go wrong. We hear a lot more about what is not working. And what I get, again, hopeful about is that because of the shift that is happening for this particular set of society, the fact that now more than 30% of women that could be working are starting to work is because of the impact it will have on the other 70%, the ones that are struggling with the issues that you are talking about. If these women are empowered and if their numbers grow, I think they're the ones who are going to find a lot of the local solutions. They're the ones who are going to vote in a different set of policymakers. They're the ones who are going to ask for a different set of laws. And that's what I found most hopeful. And it's not at all to say that a lot of those problems don't exist. They continue to exist and continue to be a very, very large problem in these societies.
We have a question here.
Hi, my name is Zainab, and I'm also from Pakistan, and I'm so grateful to get so much more insight from the research that you've done. My question is, since you've specifically looked at Muslim-majority countries, what role have you seen, or to what extent have you seen religious leaders and imams playing a role in sort of supporting these women and pulling these men along and working towards a shift in gender norms?
One of the chapters in the book is called Khadija's Daughters. And what I found interesting is how, because a lot of these women are now educated, whether it's at a primary school level, secondary school level, or university level, they're able to have a very clear view on the fact that the first convert to Islam in the world was a businesswoman. It was the first wife of the Prophet Muhammad, and a lot of them are using that fact from the history of Islam itself to build a case for why what they are doing is not just right, but is in fact valued in the history of the religion. And so I think in part that education is creating this virtuous cycle that is allowing women to talk themselves about the fact that there is nothing against the religion in the act of getting an education and in the act of going to work. So one piece of this is that. The second aspect is, I did speak to some religious leaders and religious academics. They are basically using the very same arguments. They're using the fact that Islam calls upon everyone, all Muslims, to educate themselves, boys and girls, women and men. The word is a neutral one. It is not just male Muslims, but all Muslims to educate themselves. So they're also making some of these cases. And I think that shift is coming, but it is certainly a lot quieter than it possibly could be in the future. And the same applies to policymakers. And it is not surprising, because you're talking about deeply polarized societies. You're talking about parts of societies that don't believe that women have any role outside the home, that don't believe that girls should be getting an education. And then you're talking about other parts of the very same societies, sometimes the very same city, the very same community, and maybe even the very same family, in which it is perfectly acceptable to be going to university, to be getting your own job, to be driving your car, to be having economic independence. And so it's these deeply polarized societies that I think policymakers and religious leaders are trying to balance against, and there's starting to be some shift towards catering to this rise of the new working women in the Muslim world.
Okay, I think we're going to have to wrap it here. So if you have, if I didn't get to your questions, Saadia is going to be available to answer remaining questions, sign the book. Please join me in giving her a very warm round of applause. And a shout out to all the 50 million women out there transforming their lives and transforming society. So thank you,
Sabina.